It's clear to all of us that ending drug-related deaths it's a national mission, it's a national responsibility. We all have a part to play in this. And yes, part of that is making sure we have the right services, that they're available, that they're accessible, and they are there for when people need them. But there's a wider question in my mind, and that is the question of how we think about drugs and the people who use them in our society. I think it's time that we took a step back and really asked ourselves some questions about that. One of the key influences to how we think about drugs and people who use them is the legal framework. And our framework is built on the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is now 50 years old. Things have changed a lot in 50 years. We've really shifted, I think, in our understanding and in the evidence that helps that understanding about what works to prevent harm, to reduce drug use, to prevent problematic use, and to prevent crime. I'm not sure that our legal framework reflects that learning, so I think it's time for us to be thinking about something new. And the evidence is mounting. Report after report after report is saying we need to think about a new approach. So to help push that conversation on, we wanted to share this film with you. And it's a film that shares the ideas of some people within TPS who have been working in this field for a long, long time and coming from different perspectives. They've got real ideas about what is working, what's not working, and what could work in the future. We hope that by sharing it with you, it will encourage you to ask yourself some questions and to get involved in this conversation, because it's a conversation we need to have.
Well, the law is important because what it does is it drives not just a response to the legal aspects, but it drives a culture. The 1971 Act that we're now talking about has driven a culture, but it's one that's punitive. It's one that apportions blame and consequence with a view to deter and try and control supply. We know from the facts, we know from the statistics that it's had a limited effect, but we also know that the prisons are bursting at the seams, and addiction forms a huge part of that criminal behaviour. So the time is right now to reconsider whether the 1971 Act is still delivering the results that are required with that experience and for the Scotland as it stands right now.
We need to be talking about the laws around drug use because they're preventing some of the things that are evidence-based and public health approach. So the law just now was set up at 1971 to tackle maybe a different thing for what we want to tackle just now. So we need to be talking about what that's preventing us doing. For example, evidence bases from around the world tells us that safer consumption facilities are something that reduces harm. They're a place where people can go and they can feel part of a community, they don't feel condemned for their drug use. And within these we know there's been no overdoses, and that would mean that the drug-related deaths in Scotland would reduce dramatically. We also know that we can work with individuals within them when they're injecting to get alongside them and show them how to inject, or to maybe just give them tips about how they're injecting, and that can make that practice much safer, which would mean that there won't be as much injecting related injuries. So although the law hasn't set out to get in the way of this, it has done. The law is stopping us from moving forward for where the evidence is. And another example of that is drug checking services. Drug checking services allow us to take some drugs from the individual and check the quality of that and the quantity of that. And why that's important is they're unregulated, so we don't know what the concentration of the drug is within that. We also don't know what's mixed in with that and the dangers that these things can cause. So we can tell the individual what's there and they can make that informed choice about the type of drug that they're using and the risks involved in that.
The legal framework as it stands right now actually causes harm and is unfit for purpose. In a justice system, it needs to be more responsive and based on a public health model in order to reduce offending. We know from experience that it doesn't work to punish people into recovery. Rather, people need access to good evidence-based education and information in order to make informed choices and to reduce the harm to themselves and to others. And our ability to offer this to people is really limited by the illicit nature of drugs and the stigma that surrounds them and the people that use them. This also presents a barrier to people seeking and accessing advice and support and treatment.
Our current legislation is not necessarily based on evidence. It's not based on the harm that's caused by individual drugs. So we have a classification system, and that classification system doesn't look at the harm of the drug. Actually, to understand why drugs are classified in certain ways is quite confusing. I think sometimes that maybe is a moralistic judgment that's maybe put about who in society was using which drugs at the time. And now I think we need to look at where the harm is. So let's classify things based on their own harm rather than on maybe a judgment of the type of people that are using that.
There's currently a distinction made in our legal framework that some drugs are okay but others are bad, which perpetrates the stigmatisation of the people who use the so-called bad drugs. The stigma around drug use drives drug-related harm by damaging personal relationships that can actually insulate people and further marginalising and excluding people from mainstream services. By driving self-stigma, which is where someone starts to believe the wider societal stigma around them, what we also see is an increase in a person's own belief that they're not worthy or deserving of support. Also, because drugs are illegal, people tend to engage with those involved in criminal behaviour, which in turn exposes themselves and others to the risk of violence, harm and other repercussions that can have long-lasting consequences when this could have been avoided.
So this tells me that this is an ideal time to now consider what the options would be for both a whole-scale change in the legislation, but also the things that we can act on right now in advance of whole-scale change.